If you're feeling a bit distracted or unable to focus, maybe this next talk is for you. Steve Gregos is a software engineer with a history in sales management. He's founded an employee resource group at his company for those who work in the software without a college degree, typical for their fields. He spends his free time practicing or building apprenticeship opportunities in his community, hiking, practicing photography, and playing video games. So here's Steve with your ADHD symptoms may include.
Hello again. Thank you, Sarah. So, hello everyone. My name's Steve, and thank you for having me. So, first things first is the safety check. So, what are we going to be going over in this talk? We're going to be going over what ADHD symptoms look like in adults. We are going to be talking about some addiction recovery and what that looks like for someone with ADHD, or can look like. We're going to go over the history a little bit, what it's like to change careers with ADHD, and we're going to look at, toward the end, some reasons why ADHD symptoms are worthy of conservation. So let's get started. So most people, when they think of someone with ADHD, they think of something like this. This young kid appears to be breaking his pencil in seeming frustration at the tasks his teachers are asking him to do. And for about half of the ADHD community, our conditions don't go away when we enter adulthood. But whenever I ask someone to picture what a person with ADHD looks like, I almost never get an adult. I also almost never get a woman or person of color, but that's an entirely separate talk there. And so I want you to take a moment and think about how you would describe an adult with ADHD. Most people will come up with a list that looks something like this. People with ADHD are impatient, we're loud, disruptive, we don't follow directions, we can't keep track of things, and we generally don't stop talking, ever. So if you do a quick Google search, you'll get about 5 million different ways of describing this same set of symptoms. And so I want you to keep these symptoms in mind, and I'm going to tell you guys a story for the rest of this. And by the end of this talk, you will hear this full story, unless I get distracted. So about 2 years ago, the company I worked for started ERGs. And one of the ERGs that formed out of that was a group of us who got into tech without a traditional college degree for our fields. And this group of people said, something we really need is more avenues into tech that don't require you to funnel through a university to get there. And so the group started pioneering an apprenticeship program. And this getting involved in this program turned out to be one of the most impactful experiences of my life. And I got to meet with so many different people from so many different lived experiences. I got to meet with a millionaire CEO who had lost everything. I got to meet with a teacher who just loved to code in her free time. I got to talk to someone who was convicted of murder and was a returning citizen back to society. And those were really interesting experiences, and I wouldn't have had those had I not gotten involved with this. But I wasn't just starting to learn about other people's experiences. I also started to learn more about my own. And everything was going super well, right? We had executive buy-in on this program. My job as an engineer was going well. Everything on the surface appeared to be going pretty well. Outside of the public eye, things weren't going so well. I was losing a battle with addiction to my ADHD medication. And there was an interesting duality, an interesting but painful duality with that, in that your medication becomes both your antidote and your poison at the same time. And I could win my battle with ADHD, or with my ADHD medication, but I had to live with these symptoms as the alternative. And the YouTube videos, the articles online, the way that people around me and society in general talked about ADHD symptoms, that made that decision super easy for me. And it was to stay in active addiction. So eventually I took the leap and I stopped my medication and I started to pursue a career in learning and development, talent development. Largely that was fueled by inspiration and intrigue from that apprenticeship initiative. And I asked myself a question that led me down this rabbit hole that led me here, which was I needed to understand why society had this view of ADHD. Why were these symptoms what everyone would talk about? So how did we get here? 1955, Ritalin became FDA approved. The 1960s, the American Psychiatric Association formally recognized this set of symptoms as a mental disorder. Fast forward to the 80s, the APA released their third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, pretty much the de facto standard for diagnosing someone with a mental health condition. And we got ADD, and we got two different forms of ADD. We got ADD with hyperactivity and without. And scientists actually believed back then that hyperactivity was not inherently a symptom of ADD or ADHD. So a few years later, in 1987, we finally got two distinct names. We got ADD and ADHD. And then the 90s came, and this was the ADHD boom era. And doctors were able to more efficiently diagnose ADHD. More treatments were becoming available. Parents became more educated about the condition and started to talk to their children's doctors. And more people were actually developing ADHD. So during this ADHD boom era, the ADD, ADHD community was receiving more attention than it ever had before. Doctors had taken this set of behavior patterns, these fuzzy concepts, and they gave it a name. And this led to this description of ADHD that people from all different kinds of generations internalized as threads that make up the fabric of who they are. And then something happened. There was a new president of the APA, Dr. Martin Seligman, and he looked at his colleagues and he said, what if mental health isn't about the absence or lack of mental disturbances or differences? What if instead mental health is about flourishing and well-being? And so I handed off responsibility for the apprenticeship program to someone else on the team that we had built. I came up with a succession plan for the ERG to put someone else in leadership for it. And with my newly reduced capacity to regulate my attention from beating my addiction, I needed to think very carefully about what kinds of things I could manage at a given time in my life. And this is a common dilemma for people with ADHD. We quite infamously have quite a lot of plates spinning all at once. But there's a trap here that I ran into. Because of the way ADHD is talked about, described, and ultimately the way a lot of people both with it and without it internalized the condition, we think that if we have access to tasks that are making us inattentive, we're more likely to develop energy or devote energy to those tasks. And our condition is really viewed through the lens of lack. And we're not able to regulate our attention on these things, so thus these things need to go away. And the trap here is that when you remove those, there is an expectation of behaviors for how you go about prioritizing tasks. And in most cases, those expectations are for executive functioning behaviors of someone who doesn't have ADHD. And so there's an assumption that when those things go away, that the distractions go away. And so one of the few things that was left in scope for me was my pursuance of a career in learning and development. And this was around the time that I committed to changing how I viewed ADHD. I felt like there had to be a healthier way to look at this thing that didn't make me feel so ostracized from society. And there had to be a way to explain it to people that made me feel empowered rather than made me feel smaller. So In 2018, a group of scientists came together and they conducted this rigorous study of a particularly fascinating symptom of ADHD. And there's a lot of work that needs to happen to create real change in our perception and classification of inattentiveness. But I think if we can start to make space for conversations like this, I think we might just be able to get to good enough for how we understand inattentiveness. So these scientists came together and they studied the symptom called hyperfocus. And ADHD is often misunderstood as the lack of an ability to focus, but that only paints a little bit of the picture. And when we look closer, we start to get some color in hyperfocus as a symptom. And the goal of their research was to determine whether or not there was a connection between ADHD and the ability to hyperfocus. Turns out there was. And ADHD gets impacted from hyperfocus, just like neurotypical brains can get impacted from hyperfocus. And their research showed that there were two types of flow states that people enter. The first is shallow flow. This is the flow that lets neurotypical folks prioritize tasks, switch between them with limited ramifications and generally pretty easy. They get in the zone and generally see these tasks through to completion. Then second is the deep flow states. And deep flow is a state where someone's ability to concentrate on a particular task or idea is so strong that they actually become disassociated with the world around them. And they become completely immersed in that task or idea. And what their study found was that for most people, you can enter a shallow flow state with relative ease. Deep flow is achieved far less frequently and is always precluded by a period of shallow flow. In practice, this means that someone becomes focused on a task, then either completes the task without achieving deep flow, or the person moves on to a deep flow state after spending some time in shallow flow. But then what they found was that ADHD brains don't operate that way. Those with ADHD rarely enter a state of shallow flow. And the way we typically see that described is someone is inattentive or easily distractible. However, they also discovered that those with ADHD experience high amounts of deep flow states. And we don't need the prerequisite of a shallow flow state before that. We can go straight into deep flow. And this has a lot of ramifications on how we word job descriptions and how we hire to really include people who can enter those deep flow states almost exclusively. And so I'd stepped away from the things that were making me inattentive, but I couldn't just turn my ADHD off. After spending hundreds of hours researching and building out our apprenticeship program with the team, what was really important was that an apprenticeship be an unforgettable experience. And having gone through multiple mental health crises with the people that I worked with, I knew that the support existed at the company that I was at. And the fact that an apprenticeship has the power to change someone's life was at the forefront of every decision that I made or that I weighed in on. And I began studying apprenticeships in other countries and examining schools and workplaces, workplace development programs for kids and adults with learning differences and disabilities to get a better understanding of what we needed to have in place to provide an experience that really reached and resonated with them. So what does this mean? How can this understanding of inattentiveness and hyperfocus, how do I bring that back to the workplace with me? First one is neurodiversity. Start talking about it. It is the idea that diverse neurological conditions are from brain differences, not just deficits. And there's a couple keys here. What you choose to communicate and how you communicate it sets the social tone for those conversations. Everyone is at different stages of understanding their mental health. And nobody is above or below anyone else. And this is one of my favorite things about having mental health discussions is it seems to pause any kind of existing power dynamic that's in play. And everyone is just talking to each other, human to human. The other thing is start to talk about ADHD as a difference in attention, not just a deficit. look at how jobs are performed. Do they cater to attention styles that include hyperfocus tendencies, for example? The way your career pathing works in your organization, is that pathing accessible for people who thrive in hyperfocus? Organizations also really need to see their employees as strategic partners and not a cost of doing business. And you can sort of do that by talking about the strengths that accompany ADHD and not just trying to minimize or accommodate ADHD weaknesses. So I'd had a pretty muddy journey, as this is a picture from a hike, and as a little boy pointed out to me, peanut butter shoes, that's what this is. So I'd started and stepped away from responsibilities that had been so important to me. I'd won my battle with addiction, and it's a war that I'm now equipped to fight for a long time. And I'd navigated these raw ADHD symptoms in the workplace, and I didn't get fired. I was rising as a software engineer, and I fell in love with how people learn. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I left and went on a sabbatical, and I tried to straighten it all out. And I hiked from Mexico to Canada, taking planes from each state, and just photographing the Rockies. And I also became closer to Buddhism, which isn't a coincidence, but I'll get more on that later. So I ended my sabbatical really focusing on, was there more to ADHD, the real ADHD, than hyperfocus? Turns out there is. There are other benefits. So later this same year, another group of scientists conducted a study that answers that question. And it turns out there's quite a few benefits indeed that exist on a spectrum. So what they did is they performed open-ended interviews with adults with ADHD, using first-person experiences to approach and collect data. They recorded these, they transcribed them verbatim, and they analyzed them. And they found a few things. There was an entire group of people who talked about their ADHD in a different way, in a way that was empowering. And they talked about things like hyperfocus and eidetic learning, which is the ability to learn from really vividly recalled events and experiences. And the medical community uses that standard, the DSM, for diagnosing mental health conditions. And Dr. Seligman, who pioneered the positive psychology movement, created the opposite. He created the CSV, the character strengths and virtues. And what he wanted to do with that was he wanted to understand prescriptively what promotes well-being and flourishing in everyday people's lives. And so these scientists looked at what neurotypical folks typically identify on the CSV, and then they looked at what ADHD folks identify on the CSV. And they compared these lists and wanted to see what attributes were specific to folks with ADHD. So they found some things. People with ADHD are cognitively dynamic. So this is a big word. This is a new one. This was a new one for me too. So what do they mean by this? They mean this is having ceaseless mental activity, where you have spontaneous, non-sequential thoughts, but you have so many of them that you become energized. And some of the sub-themes for this that we'll go over, divergent thinking, hyperfocus, creativity, and curiosity. Some of these are owned by everyone. Some of them are specific to ADHD. We'll get into that. Energy was another character strength and virtue that they talked about. And what they mean by energy is the intensity of internal experiences and the capacity for action. And they have three sub-themes. They have spiritual, psychological, and physical. And I realized when I was out on my sabbatical, my deep interest in Buddhism was fueled by this. And spirit here is an experience that embraces a higher level of self, sense of purpose, or meaning in life. There isn't a religious connotation necessarily. And then psychological energy is when someone has volition. So the will to decide or commit to a particular course of action. And what happens is that high volition requires someone to have this high desire to achieve something, and that eventually transforms that psychological energy into physical energy. So there's a couple course corrections that we can make from all of this research. People with ADHD are not slow workers. Divergent thinking was one of the sub-themes here that came out specifically for people with ADHD, and that is the ability to generate these novel or original ideas. We do that by exploring many different possible solutions, where a neurotypical brain might go, okay, I have solution A, B, and C, I'm going to go with B. An ADHD brain might say, I have A, B, and C, I want to understand what D, E, F, G is. And so we explore all of those solutions. And as such, divergent thinking is actually a measurement of creativity, how much of an outside of the box thinker you are. Another one that was unique to ADHD is hyperfocus. We already went over this, so I'm going to skip over that. NonConformism. So NonConformism is closely linked to courage, and we deal particularly well with uncertainty and crisis. And feeling different for us can start at a really young age, and it starts with the public school system. And nonconformism really at its core is a resistance to social or cultural modification, I guess you could say. And as a result of feeling different, of being nonconformist, a lot of people with ADHD struggle for recognition, and they get misrecognized. Their behaviors, which are generally well-intended or to them are perceived as well, are perceived as someone being difficult or wanting to do things a way that no one else wants to do them. And so the misrecognition of ADHD as a disability exclusively accentuates how this sort of labeling and stereotyping can be used to sort of put us in boxes. And it's important to know that this misrecognition is a social process. It is not necessarily an internal process only. It is also a social process. So what else? We're not impulsive risk takers, we're adventurous. And there's something interesting here with this one, because this had to do with how other people react to our behaviors. So someone exhibits a particular behavior, and if the reaction was negative, it was viewed as impulsive. But when the reaction was positive, then the action or the behavior was described as spontaneous and intuitive. And so there's a willingness that develops here to be brave, to take those risks, to be adventurous, and to be responsible for your actions. And all of that leads to really high levels of integrity and authenticity in people with ADHD. And a hallmark of that behavior is how much intrinsic motivation someone has. We're moved by the challenge or fun that we see in something. And so we generally don't move very much to external rewards or external pressures. That isn't how ADHD brains typically tick. We can't be bought. And it's this intrinsic motivation, this thrill of the hunt of an idea, that allows us to maintain a positive sense of self while we're embarking and navigating our adventure. And this is what makes ADHD brains really good at reaching some goal that they have. Okay. We aren't making excuses. We are accepting ourselves. This study also concluded that successful adults with ADHD had an intensely positive mental attitude. And this helps us cope with things like stress by giving us this biologically effective tooling in our ADHD to promote well-being, for example, during a crisis. We're damage control experts and can maintain this positive attitude when neurotypical brains maybe have some different views. And I want to hit on something really important here. And it's that sometimes the most difficult people to accept in your lives are ourselves, our family, our spouse, our friends. And by accepting not just your limitations, but also what you excel at, you make space to accept others as they are, based on their strengths and their weaknesses. And if you only see the deficits, the missing pieces in yourself, that's all you're going to see in others. And this is what makes ADHD brains so exceptional at things like social work, social justice work, and work in the D&I space. We aren't naive. We excel at sublimation. Sublimation was another new one for me. And that is the unconscious defense mechanism. It's not deliberate, it's not by choice. It is the ability to alter a person's perception of an external or internal experience. And in doing so, that person protects against the effects of stress, anxiety, depression, and so on. Things that could be taken as inappropriate behavior or odd. We sort of perform this cognitive reappraisal of it as an act of self-preservation. It's something we're really good at. So what can we take away from these? So we want to start talking less about these, and we want to start talking more about these. There are a few structural pieces that make this cognitive reappraisal more successful when you go to implement it. So what are those things? The first is it's really important to have two-way empathy. And what I mean by that is for someone who has ADHD, it's very easy to become jaded toward people, or maybe even a whole organization, because from our set of shoes, it can get frustrating. People always saying, you're not prioritizing tasks correctly, you shouldn't do this, you should do this instead, when really we think we should be doing this and not the thing you want us to do. And so it can get really frustrating. And likewise for the person on the other end, it can get really frustrating where you're just trying to help this person navigate a situation, and it seems like they really aren't doing what you're suggesting. And having that two-way empathy, that both sides of this are experiencing frustration, is really important. And one big piece of that is the role that mentors play. And there were plenty of times where me and my mentor would go out for a walk, and I would be talking about how difficult it is to stay sober. And if I went back on my medication, all these struggles of managing this career while trying to navigate into this other one, all of that would have went away. And so sometimes those walks would just be talking about the struggle of addiction. And it's really important to have a release valve, whether that's in a mentor, whether that's in a family member. You need somewhere to be able to talk about these internal experiences. And there's also a key part of this that's having an informed team, because you can come to all these conclusions, but if your team isn't made aware of these kinds of experiences, how can they possibly know about them? And there's some work that they do on their own, but there's also a little bit of work from us. And I think it's actually helpful for us to be able to talk about these things out in the open. And a big part of that is having leadership that has an open mind. Some organizations' leadership is sort of stuck in their ways. And using a strengths-based approach to job descriptions, promotion pathways, how you hire, isn't necessarily how most places work by default. Most places work on building up your weaknesses. A big way to do this is something called job crafting. Job crafting is where you take a look at your strengths and cater your job to those strengths. And That might be eliminating some duties. That might be idiosyncratic deals where, you know you have a strength and you have a weakness. And so you ask this person to take care of the weakness and you'll take care of the thing that you have a strength in, and everyone wins. But it requires some work between the person and the organization. And that's really where viewing employees as strategic partners, that has to be laid as the foundation first for that to work. And so that's it. And I will leave you with this, in that, what if this way of viewing and promoting the internalization of mental health conditions isn't just limited to ADHD? Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Hopefully our very active Slack right now wasn't being too distracting during your talk. It's good to see a lot of people chiming in about this talk in particular. Do you think, or actually one of our attendees had mentioned that they've been working on skills with their therapist. Do you have any good tools or approaches that you could use to help accommodate some of those ADHD things, or things like to-do lists or Pomodoro techniques, other things like that?
Sure. So I do want to say it's different for everyone, so this isn't going to be a silver bullet. There is no real silver bullet answer. Some things that have helped with me, color coordinating things, whether this is different things in my IDE when I'm engineering. My Google Calendar is like a rainbow, and on the note of the calendar, if something isn't in my calendar, it doesn't exist. There's a 0% chance I'll remember. And even if it's in my calendar, if I'm really into something, it still might not exist. So making sure that you have like notifications turned on, and that this event on your calendar will send you a notification on your desktop, that's super important. Some things that have also helped is getting, if you're in an open office environment, either that's the most difficult one, I think, for me. And some things that have helped were a really good pair of noise canceling headphones, a set of desk dividers, which are literally like sort of soundproof walls you can put on the corners of your desk. And it's kind of awesome because you like have your own fort pretty much, and it's pretty cool. And then the alternative is working from home. Strangely enough, working from home, I'm kind of always stimulated by all the things around me in my house. And so I don't really need to like go searching for stimulation. And so I'm able to actually just sit here and do my work. And I think those are probably the biggest ones.
Yeah, I'm definitely a little bit overstimulated in my home too sometimes, especially with the cats. I had a thought while we were talking a bit, and it seems like developers, are usually kind of have to be thinking outside the box, and even some of the other symptoms you had mentioned. I was kind of wondering if like C-level people or other managers might not be so much, like they're just, their way of thinking is a little bit different, and if there might be some conflict there between, the, I guess, more creators and engineers that might have some more of those symptoms versus like those that might not be, and if there's any good way to resolve maybe some of those conflicts.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to, if you make the decision to disclose your ADHD at work, it's really important to advocate for yourself. And it's really scary in the beginning, because most of the time when you disclose something like ADHD, you have no clue how people are going to react. And so I think the best way to sort of go about it is just hammering it out. Just talking it out and saying, listen, there's some aspects, some dimensions of my identity that make me really good at particular things in engineering. And just being honest with, hey, I get really good at these things, but these things are just not going to tick for me. And I don't want to say it's a negotiation, but it's an acknowledgement that a lot of these skills exist on a spectrum, and that some skills can have their ceiling, their cap increased, or they can have their ceiling or cap decreased. from that ADHD.
Maybe less negotiation and more collaboration, perhaps.
Right. Collaboration, not negotiation. Yeah.